The night began with laughter echoing through a billionaire's mansion. Under glittering chandeliers, the wealthy mocked a woman in a maid's uniform, spilling champagne at her feet, sneering as she passed. To them, she was invisible, just another servant to humiliate. But what none of them knew was that behind the plain apron stood the true power in the room. And before the night was over, their arrogance would shatter in front of everyone. The mansion stood at the edge of the city like a fortress of arrogance. Marble columns rose against the sunlight, polished so brightly that they seemed to mock the dust and sweat of the workers who passed through its iron gates. It was the morning of the grand gala, a gathering of billionaires, socialites, and politicians, all dressed in tailored suits and glittering gowns. The driveway glittered with luxury cars, their doors opening to spill out the elite who strutted up the staircase as though the world itself bowed beneath their heels. Amid this parade of wealth and ego, one figure did not belong. She wore a plain black uniform, starched but faded at the edges. A white apron was tied neatly around her waist, the bow slightly crooked because she had fastened it herself in a hurry. Her shoes, though polished, had scuffs that told stories of years of work, and her skin, a deep brown that glistened under the sun, marked her as someone the wealthy rarely noticed unless they needed a table cleared or a glass refilled. She was the maid, just the maid. The crowd of billionaires barely glanced her way. When they did, it was with that faint curl of the lip, that quick dismissal reserved for people who served rather than ruled. As she climbed the steps into the mansion, whispers trailed behind her like smoke. What was she doing entering through the same grand doors reserved for the elite? Staff were meant to slip in quietly through the service entrances, unseen and unheard. Her presence here was an offense to their unspoken hierarchy. Inside the mansion, chandeliers dripped crystals from the high ceiling. Golden light spilled across marble floors, illuminating oil paintings of ancestors who had built empires through greed and cunning. At the far end of the hall, a cluster of billionaires clutched glasses of champagne, their laughter echoing like glass breaking. When their eyes fell on the maid, their amusement sharpened into something crueler. Some smirked, others chuckled, and a few exchanged knowing glances as though her presence was the evening's first entertainment. Her steps did not falter. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, her back straight, chin lifted, not in arrogance, but in defiance of the shame they wanted her to feel. She knew their eyes burned holes in her uniform, but she also knew something they did not. Something that would turn their laughter into silence before the night was over. But at that moment, the humiliation pressed in like a storm. A billionaire's wife, draped in diamonds, deliberately shifted aside as the maid passed, as if brushing against her would tarnish the silk. Another man coughed theatrically, pretending the air itself was fouled by her presence. Their cruelty was subtle, but it was sharp, designed to cut deep without ever raising a hand. She kept walking, each step a battle against the weight of their contempt. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but she refused to let it show. The gala had only just begun, and already the line between who belonged and who did not had been drawn like a scar across the polished floor. At the base of the staircase, a photographer snapped pictures of the billionaires descending in glitter and gold. When the maid crossed into frame, the photographer lowered the camera with visible irritation, as though her very image would ruin the perfection of the evening's archive. Laughter rippled through the room again. Quiet, stifled, but cruel. It was the kind of laughter that said, "You do not belong. You never will." The humiliation was complete. The maid stood at the center of the grand hall, surrounded by wealth and power, yet treated as invisible, no, worse than invisible. She was a trespasser in their kingdom of opulence. What none of them knew, what none of them even imagined, was that the very ground beneath their expensive shoes was about to shift. For the maid was not who they thought she was. Her uniform was a disguise, her silence a weapon, and hidden behind the scorn they hurled at her was a secret powerful enough to bring the walls of this mansion crashing down. As the billionaires laughed, as the chandeliers sparkled and the orchestra began to play, a storm gathered silently in the heart of the maid. Tonight everything would change. Tonight the powerful would learn what it meant to underestimate the one they dismissed. And though no one knew it yet, This night would not end in champagne and celebration. It would end in shock, in shattered pride, and in the revelation of a truth that had been waiting far too long to be seen. The maid paused at the center of the room, her hands steady, her gaze sharp. The laughter still echoed, but already it seemed weaker, thinner. A clock struck in the distance, its chimes marking the beginning of an evening none of them would forget. The humiliation was real, the pain undeniable. But so was the storm about to come. And with every tick of the clock, the distance between who they thought she was and who she truly was drew closer to collapse. The stage was set, the audience was blind, and the maid, dismissed, mocked, underestimated, was ready to change everything. Long before the maid stepped through those towering doors, her story had begun in places the billionaires of that mansion would never set foot in. Her world had been carved from modest streets, where cracked sidewalks told stories of hardship, and old brick houses leaned under the weight of time. It was here, in the rhythm of labor and the grit of survival, that she had learned the lessons wealth could never teach. Her mother had been a cleaner, her father a mechanic whose hands were always stained with oil. From them, she inherited two things: the dignity of work and the certainty that life was never going to hand her an easy road. While the privileged children of the city played in manicured backyards and swam in private pools, she studied beneath flickering streetlights, balancing books on her knees because the library closed too early. Every A she earned in school felt like rebellion, every certificate a small torch against the darkness of poverty. Yet, no matter how bright her achievements shone, the world around her often refused to see them. Teachers underestimated her, bosses overlooked her, and at every turn, the color of her skin, the plainness of her clothes, or the weariness in her shoes seemed to overshadow her brilliance. She became accustomed to whispers, to laughter muffled behind hands, to the subtle exclusions that drew a line between her and those who believed they were born to rule. But hidden within her silence was resilience. She didn't protest when people dismissed her. She stored their words like fuel, burning hotter with every slight. She worked double shifts when others quit. She saved money when others spent. And while the wealthy lived extravagantly, certain their riches would multiply forever, she invested carefully in places they sneered at, quiet ventures that grew in the shadows of their skyscrapers. Her journey into the mansion that night wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of years of work unseen. Still, none of the billionaires knew that. To them, she was just another uniformed shadow moving through the background of their parties. That invisibility had always been their mistake. Behind her modest uniform, there was an education. Degrees earned through scholarships and nights of relentless study. Behind her calm gaze was knowledge of markets, industries, and technologies that most of those billionaires had ignored, assuming the future would bend to their arrogance. Behind her steady hands was ownership, shares and stakes, properties and contracts, that told a story none of them had written, yet one they were about to be forced to read. For years, she had walked among people who mocked her. She had served them dinners, polished their silver, and cleared their plates while listening to the careless way they spoke about people like her. In their world, she was less. In hers, she was building something more. The uniform she wore that night wasn't humiliation. It was armor. It was the mask that let her move unseen, the disguise that allowed her to walk straight into the heart of the very empire that had once tried to deny her existence. To them, she was a servant. To herself, she was the storm waiting to be unleashed. But make no mistake, this was not just her struggle. Her story carried the weight of countless others who had been dismissed, mocked, or excluded. Every step she had taken had been alongside a history of resilience, a legacy of people who had endured and survived. She walked into that mansion not as one maid, but as the embodiment of an entire lineage of underdogs underestimated. Still, the pain of being overlooked left scars. The humiliation of being passed over for promotions, of hearing laughter when she entered rooms, of feeling eyes roll when she spoke. All of it had etched itself into her memory. That pain became her weapon, shaping her into someone who would not only endure but rise. And now, here she was, walking past chandeliers and marble floors, carrying the weight of her past with every step. The billionaires could not see it, But the storm was close. The humiliation they thought they had inflicted tonight was only an echo of the underestimation she had endured her entire life. But endurance had sharpened into strategy. The maid who stood in the grand hall carried more than a tray or broom. She carried secrets the billionaires had no idea existed. She carried power in places they had ignored. She carried truth that would strike harder than any insult they whispered in their champagne circles. The night was young. The billionaires believed themselves untouchable, their laughter bouncing off walls draped in wealth. But deep beneath the glitter and arrogance, something was shifting. They were blind to it because they had never bothered to look closely at those they considered beneath them. And in their blindness they had built their own downfall. What none of them knew was that the maid, quiet, steady, underestimated, was about to force them to see her for who she really was. And the shock waiting for them would be greater than any storm they had ever known. The world inside the mansion glittered, but its foundation was already trembling. The music in the mansion swelled, violins filling the air with elegance that masked the sharpness of arrogance dripping from every corner of the room. Billionaires clustered together in tight circles, their laughter weaving into the symphony like knives disguised as melodies. The maid's presence was still a disruption, a blemish on their polished night, and they were not about to let it go unpunished. At first, it was the whispers. They floated through the hall like smoke, designed to sting but never to be traced back. Words like out of place and service doors fluttered behind manicured hands holding crystal glasses. The laughter grew sharper, more deliberate, the way predators laugh when they smell weakness. The maid, standing tall in her simple uniform, felt the weight of those words pressing on her skin like thorns. Then came the gestures. A billionaire's daughter, draped in a gown heavy with sequins, made a point of dropping her clutch onto the marble floor right beside the maid. She watched with thinly veiled amusement as the maid bent to pick it up. When the clutch was returned, the young woman smirked and whispered something to her circle, setting off another ripple of cruel laughter. The maid's eyes did not flinch, but inside, the storm thickened. Soon others joined in. A pair of men in tailored tuxedos accidentally spilled champagne near her shoes, offering no apology, only smirks. A woman adjusted her diamond necklace and said loudly enough for the hall to hear, "I thought the staff knew their place." Heads turned, and the humiliation spread like fire, invisible but searing. Every action was a reminder that she did not belong, or at least that's what they wanted her to believe. The maid's silence, however, unsettled them. She did not snap back. She did not run. She stood her ground, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. To them, this was defiance, and defiance from someone they dismissed as nothing only fueled their cruelty further. The gala's host, an older billionaire whose wealth had been built on generations of inherited privilege, raised his glass and made a show of glancing at the maid. His lips curled into a smile that held no kindness. "We keep lowering our standards," he muttered, just loud enough for his guests to hear. The words sent another wave of chuckles rolling through the glittering crowd. They toasted to the joke, clinking glasses as if celebrating her humiliation was part of the evening's entertainment. But beneath the surface of that mockery, fear trembled unseen. Her calm, her dignity, it was unsettling. They expected shame, tears, or retreat. Instead, they saw resilience. And resilience in someone they wanted beneath them felt like a threat they could not name. The orchestra played on. Chandeliers glittered above. Yet the atmosphere was poisoned by cruelty. Every glance sharp, every laugh laced with malice. The maid moved quietly, stepping deeper into the hall, her heart steady even as the storm around her grew louder. She had endured worse than whispers. She had survived harsher humiliations. And tonight she would endure again, not because she had to, but because the game was almost over. The billionaires, however, mistook her silence for submission. They escalated further. One man, bold with arrogance and drunk on wealth, stepped directly in her path, blocking her way. He looked her up and down, sneered, and then stepped aside with exaggerated flourish as though granting her permission to exist. His friends laughed, clapping him on the back for the performance. It was theater to them, her humiliation, their amusement. They had no idea they were writing the opening act of their own downfall. The night deepened. The party glittered brighter. And yet, the cruelty clung to her like smoke. But inside her chest, the storm gathered strength, lightning coiling in silence. Each insult was another strike waiting to be released. They believed they were in control. They believed the maid would remain nothing more than a shadow in their golden world. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, their certainty began to tremble, though they did not yet realize it. For the maid was not bending. She was not breaking. And soon, the moment would come when the laughter would stop, the arrogance would collapse, and the mansion that had mocked her would echo with a silence none of them were prepared to face. The billionaires raised their glasses again, toasting to their own superiority, blind to the truth standing quietly among them. They thought they were escalating humiliation. In reality, they were digging the pit of their own disgrace. And as the maid's gaze swept across the hall, sharp as lightning cutting through storm clouds, the air shifted. The storm was closer now, its arrival inevitable. The laughter of the rich filled the mansion still, but it was hollow, fragile. They didn't know it yet, but the night was about to shatter. The laughter still lingered in the air when the moment arrived. It was subtle at first, like the quiet roll of thunder before the storm. The maid, calm, steady, unshaken, moved toward the center of the grand hall. Her plain uniform was still crisp, her apron still tied, but there was something in her presence now that unsettled the edges of arrogance surrounding her. She no longer seemed like a servant moving through shadows. She stood as if the room itself belonged to her. A bell chimed, signaling the gala's transition into speeches. Billionaires gathered, eager to hear themselves praised, to congratulate one another for their supposed brilliance. The host took the stage, raising his champagne glass high. His words began in the same tone they always did, boasting of empires, of wealth, of the legacy of power built into the bones of the mansion. The audience listened, smug, certain of their superiority. But then, as the host prepared to introduce the evening's distinguished guest of honor, the unexpected happened. The maid stepped forward. She didn't hurry, didn't stumble. She walked with purpose, her footsteps echoing against the marble like a drumbeat that silenced the whispers. Heads turned, brows furrowed, and laughter cracked into confusion. Who was this woman? Why was she moving toward the stage? Security shifted uneasily, glancing at the host, waiting for instruction. But before any order could be given, the maid ascended the stage. Her gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of those who had mocked her only moments before. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though the chandeliers themselves had dimmed in anticipation. And then the host's smile faltered. He knew something the others didn't. Because this maid, this woman they had humiliated, dismissed, and mocked, was not who they thought. She was not staff. She was not a trespasser. She was the owner. The documents had been signed weeks ago. The mansion, the estate, the companies tied to its wealth, all of it now bore her name. Quietly, strategically, she had acquired everything piece by piece, her investments weaving through the blind spots of billionaires too arrogant to notice. While they partied, she had purchased. While they mocked, she had maneuvered. And while they toasted to their own power, she had taken it from beneath their noses. Gasps rippled through the hall as her name was announced, not as maid, but as the new chairwoman, the rightful heir to the very gathering they believed she was unworthy of attending. The shock was electric, snapping through the air like lightning. Faces that had smirked twisted into disbelief, glasses froze midair, and whispers spiraled into stunned silence. The billionaires who had spilled champagne at her feet now stood rooted in place, unable to reconcile the uniform with the truth. The woman they thought invisible was suddenly towering above them, not because of height, but because of the weight of power. Her uniform, once a symbol of humiliation, became a weapon of revelation. She had worn it deliberately not to blend in, but to expose them, to reveal their arrogance, their cruelty, their blindness. They had mocked her without hesitation, believing she was beneath them. Now the truth burned in their eyes. They had mocked the very person who now held the keys to their fortunes, their reputations, their carefully curated lives. The orchestra faltered, the music stuttering into silence. For the first time that night, the billionaires were speechless. The humiliation they had orchestrated so gleefully reversed itself in an instant. Every laugh, every whisper, every cruel gesture was now a chain dragging them down. Their arrogance had written the script of their own disgrace. And at the center of it all stood the maid who was no maid at all. Her chin lifted, her eyes steady, her silence thundering louder than any speech. The twist was complete. The underdog they had dismissed had become the storm that broke their certainty. The mansion no longer echoed with laughter. It trembled under the weight of revelation. But this was only the beginning. For humiliation, once reversed, does not simply vanish. It lingers, demanding consequences. The billionaire's downfall had only just begun. And as the maid stepped fully into the light, shedding the disguise of servitude, the hall held its breath. Justice had arrived not with fury, but with truth. And nothing would ever be the same. The silence that followed the revelation was unlike any silence the mansion had ever known. Chandeliers still glowed, champagne still fizzed in crystal glasses, and the orchestra still clutched their instruments. But the air was frozen, heavy with disbelief. For the billionaires, the room no longer glittered. It closed in around them like a cage. Their faces told the story. The sneers had vanished, replaced by pale skin stretched tight over shock. Glasses hovered midair, forgotten. Some guests looked at one another for reassurance, desperate to believe they had misheard. Others stood rigid, eyes darting between the woman in the maid's uniform and the stage where her name had just been announced with authority. It was impossible. It had to be. How could the woman they mocked, the one they spilled champagne near and treated as invisible, now stand revealed as the very owner of the mansion? But the truth could not be dismissed. The documents had already been filed, the contracts sealed, the signatures witnessed. The empire they thought unshakable had quietly shifted beneath their polished shoes. And the maid's silence, once their source of amusement, now thundered louder than any humiliation they had ever inflicted. Whispers began to spread through the hall, sharp and panicked. Some guests covered their mouths, replaying every cruel word they had uttered, every dismissive glance they had thrown. They remembered the laughter, the spilled drinks, the gestures meant to degrade. And now each memory cut back at them, sharper than broken glass. The orchestra lowered their bows, uncertain whether to continue. Even the servers, those who had slipped quietly through the background all evening, paused in awe, their eyes widening with something close to pride. For once, it wasn't the billionaires who held the stage. It was one of their own, someone who had once lived in the shadows of wealth, now standing above the very people who had tried to crush her. The host, whose mocking smile had lit the earlier hours, stood trembling. His glass shook in his hand. He had raised it in arrogance, toasted to her humiliation, and now his own disgrace burned through him like fire. He tried to force a laugh, but the sound cracked in his throat, empty and hollow. His empire, his pride, was already bending under the weight of the truth. And as the reality sank in, the humiliation turned. Billionaires who had once leaned into cruelty now leaned into fear. They saw the way their actions had been witnessed by everyone in the hall. Every insult was now evidence, every laugh a confession of arrogance. The crowd itself shifted, no longer united in mocking the maid, but divided in shame and unease. Some tried to recover, plastering smiles across their faces, pretending they had known all along. But the effort was transparent, flimsy as glass under pressure. Others hung their heads, the weight of regret pressing them lower than the chandeliers overhead. A few whispered apologies that never reached her ears, too cowardly to speak them aloud. The maid, no, the owner, stood silent, her eyes scanning the room. She didn't need to speak. The reversal was complete. In her silence, every guest was forced to confront themselves, to see their reflection not in the gleam of gold or marble, but in the cruelty they had revealed. And humiliation, once turned inward, spread quickly. A billionaire's daughter who had dropped her clutch earlier now flushed red, her sequined gown suddenly feeling like a costume of shame. The men who had spilled champagne shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her gaze. The women who whispered about knowing their place now clutched their pearls as though they could hide behind them. The storm had struck, but the devastation was not fire and fury. It was truth, and truth was more unbearable than any destruction. Yet beneath the humiliation, something else stirred in the crowd. For the servers, the workers, the invisible shadows of the night, this moment was a spark. They stood taller, prouder, their quiet gazes filled with hope. For once, the power had shifted, and they had witnessed it firsthand. The billionaires might have felt the sting of humiliation, but those who had been dismissed and overlooked felt something else. Vindication. The balance had shifted, and in that shift lay the promise of change. Still, the night was not finished. The revelation had shattered arrogance, but consequences lingered. Wealth built on cruelty does not collapse quietly, and pride humiliated does not fade without a fight. The guests, though stunned, would not accept their downfall easily, and the maid, now owner, knew the storm had only begun to break. The mansion trembled with silence, but beneath that silence, new tensions coiled. The billionaires had been humiliated, but humiliation breeds desperation. And desperation, when cornered, can be dangerous. The storm had revealed its power, but its full force was still to come. The mansion, once a stage for arrogance, now stood transformed into something unrecognizable. The chandeliers still shone, but their light no longer reflected the untouchable pride of the billionaires. Instead, it exposed their unease, their shame, their trembling disbelief. Where laughter had once echoed, silence now reigned. And in that silence, a shift of power became undeniable. The woman who had entered in the plain uniform of a maid stood as the axis upon which the night turned. She had not shouted, had not demanded respect with fury or rage. Instead, she had revealed truth. Truth so undeniable that the very foundations of the gala cracked beneath it. The billionaires, who had moments before treated her as invisible, were now forced to see her in a light brighter than any chandelier. The host, once proud and commanding, found himself diminished. His voice, which had carried authority through countless galas, faltered when he tried to reclaim control. The crowd did not listen. Their eyes were not on him anymore. They were fixed on her. She had become the center, the gravity pulling every gaze. And for the first time, the wealthy elite who had mocked her now stood on unsteady ground, their certainty replaced with fear. Slowly, the tables began to turn in more than just metaphor. Conversations shifted. Guests who had sneered earlier now whispered nervously, unsure of how to approach the woman they had dismissed. Some attempted to mask their fear with politeness, offering weak smiles that crumbled under her steady gaze. Others tried to step closer, desperate to mend what they had broken, but the distance between them was no longer physical. It was carved by truth, and it was vast. The workers of the mansion, servers, cleaners, staff, watched with quiet awe. For years they had moved like shadows, unacknowledged, their labor taken for granted. Tonight they saw something different. Someone who looked like them, someone who had been underestimated as they had been, now standing above the very people who had long ignored their existence. A quiet pride swelled among them, their shoulders lifting, their steps steadier. For once they were not invisible. The billionaires, on the other hand, crumbled beneath the weight of their own arrogance. Every insult they had cast returned to them, magnified by the revelation. They had exposed themselves, not her. Their cruelty, their entitlement, their mockery had become a mirror, and now the whole room saw them for what they were. Their wealth no longer shielded them. It only highlighted the smallness of their character. The woman's silence was not weakness. It was justice. She had not needed to humiliate them with words. They had humiliated themselves. By underestimating her, by mocking her without hesitation, they had revealed the emptiness of their pride. And in the revelation of who she truly was, the humiliation shifted entirely onto them. But resolution was not merely about their downfall, it was about her rise. Standing on the stage, she became more than the owner of a mansion or the holder of wealth. She became a symbol of resilience, of strength forged in silence, of dignity that could not be broken no matter how many whispers or insults pressed against it. The crowd, stunned into stillness, had no choice but to accept the truth. She was not beneath them. She was not their servant. She was their equal and in many ways their superior. For while they had inherited power, she had built hers. While they flaunted arrogance, she had carried dignity. And while they laughed at shadows, she had walked in silence toward the light. As the night stretched on, the billionaires found themselves subdued, their laughter gone, their pride fractured. They could no longer deny what stood before them. The tables had turned, and nothing could change it back. The mansion had been a monument to their arrogance. Now it stood as the stage of their humiliation and her triumph. The chandeliers glittered, but they no longer illuminated untouchable power. They illuminated truth. And the truth was this: they had underestimated her. They had mocked her. And in doing so, they had handed her the power to reveal them for what they truly were. The storm had broken. Justice had arrived, not with rage, but with revelation. Yet even in victory, the night was not over. For the story was not just about humiliation or triumph. It was about something greater, something that would outlast the glitter of the gala and echo far beyond the mansion walls. The lesson was not yet spoken, but it hung in the air, waiting to be revealed. The mansion had grown quiet. What began as a night of laughter and arrogance ended in stillness heavy enough to echo in the hearts of everyone present. The chandeliers still sparkled, the polished marble still gleamed, but the air was different now, thicker, heavier, filled with a truth that could not be erased. The woman who had entered in the plain uniform of a maid had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had undone the pride of an entire room. The billionaires, once untouchable in their arrogance, now bore the weight of their own humiliation. Their cruelty, which they had so carelessly unleashed, had become the very mirror that reflected their downfall. They could not undo the smirks, the whispers, the laughter. They could not erase the memory of spilling champagne near her feet, or of mocking her presence with words meant to diminish. Those actions would live forever, not as entertainment, but as evidence of their blindness. Yet she did not linger on their shame. She did not gloat or bask in their discomfort. Her power was not rooted in revenge. It was rooted in dignity. And dignity, once revealed, does not need to scream. It simply stands, undeniable, unshakable. The moral of the night stretched far beyond the mansion's gilded walls. Those who had witnessed the transformation would never forget it. The servers who had worked in silence saw in her a reflection of themselves, a promise that invisibility was not weakness, but often a mask hiding quiet strength. They learned that worth was not determined by uniforms, titles, or wealth. It was determined by character, by resilience, by the refusal to let humiliation define one's value. The billionaires, whether they admitted it or not, also carried a lesson away from that night. They had believed wealth made them superior. They had believed status placed them above accountability. But they were wrong. Their arrogance had blinded them, and in mocking her, they had mocked themselves. Power, they discovered, is fragile when built only on pride. True power lies not in gold or marble, but in dignity that endures humiliation and rises stronger. For the woman, the journey was never about proving herself to them. She did not need their approval, their validation, or their applause. Her story was about something larger. The quiet reminder that every person dismissed, every voice ignored, carries a truth the world cannot afford to overlook. She had worn the maid's uniform not because she belonged beneath them, but because she knew that the disguise would expose who they really were. And it had. The mansion, which once seemed like a fortress of arrogance, now felt different. To some, it felt smaller, its walls less imposing, its grandeur less impressive. To others, it felt heavier, burdened by the memory of laughter that had turned to shame. But to her, it was no longer a symbol of exclusion. It was a symbol of triumph, not triumph in wealth, but in truth. As the final hour of the gala approached, the orchestra played again, but the music was changed. Softer, slower, filled with reverence rather than arrogance. Guests left quietly, their footsteps subdued, their heads bowed. No one dared laugh now. The night had stripped away the illusion that power was unshakable, untouchable. They walked into the darkness of the city not as conquerors but as humbled witnesses. The woman remained behind, standing beneath the chandeliers one last time. The mansion that had once felt hostile now stood silent, no longer a place of mockery, but a stage where justice had been revealed. She did not need to speak her lesson aloud. The night itself had spoken it for her. And the lesson was this: never underestimate those who seem small. Never dismiss the quiet, the overlooked, the underestimated. For dignity, though invisible, carries a strength that wealth cannot buy, that arrogance cannot silence. The maid who was no maid at all had revealed that true power is not in laughter that mocks, nor in wealth that isolates, nor in titles that divide. True power is in resilience, in patience, in the courage to stand silent while the world mocks, because silence often hides storms greater than anyone imagines. The story of that night spread far beyond the mansion. It became more than gossip, more than a scandal whispered in elite circles. It became a parable, a reminder, a warning. For those who had mocked her, it was a lesson written in shame. For those who had been dismissed, it was a spark of hope. And for everyone who heard it, it was a reminder that the measure of worth is never in appearances, but in truth. As she walked away from the mansion, the uniform still on her shoulders, the city lights stretched before her. She had not needed to change her clothes to prove her worth. The world had changed around her instead. And though the billionaires would rebuild their pride in the days to come, they would never forget the night the maid walked into the mansion and revealed the storm hidden in silence. Because sometimes the smallest figure in the room carries the greatest power. And sometimes dignity, long overlooked, is the force that changes everything.